Greetings, everyone. Happy December. We're going to get underway shortly. Welcome. Just a couple of notes before we start. For one thing, everybody who's joined, who's in this, we're not professional actors. And everybody's volunteering their time. So no matter how big or small people's platforms are, please, if you're going to be in chat, be respectful. Jack is my wingman in there, and if he tells you to go away, then then listen. Okay. Oh yes, thank you for so I wrote a little thing. Right. Welcome, lords, ladies, and gentlethems. Tonight we will be presenting Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Dickens wrote this in 1843, and it set the template for a lot of, what we think of as Christmas stuff. But before there was Dickens, and before there was even a name or a thing that is Christmas, people have always gathered in the darkest, coldest times of the year to sing songs and tell stories and just, remind each other that the light will come back and things will get better. And, those stories were all about hope. And though I know, we have people from Australia, so it's not literally the darkest time of year for everyone, I think we can all agree it's been kind of dark. So I thought, we would gather in the way that we can and tell each other this story, which is about hope. That very special hope that no matter what has gone before, if we put in the work, we can always choose to be better. And hopefully it doesn't take a bunch of ghosts for the rest of us to get there. So, that is my little thingy. And I'm going to show you our cast for the first So that is our cast, and now here's everybody. So we need, Ian, if you want to turn your camera on, you're in this scene, and that is everybody in the scene. There we go. Okay. Marley was dead to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. Old Marley was dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hand shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat, emphatically, that Marley was dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead. Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. That this must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I am going to relate. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted, hand-to-the-grindstone Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. Secret and self-contained, as solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose. Ooh, I realized I forgot to. The cold within him froze his features, nipped his pointed nose, shriveled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head, and on his eyebrows, and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days, and did not thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. Once upon a time, of all the good old days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting-house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and you could hear the people in the court outside go whizzing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day. It had not been light all day, and the candles were flaring in the windows of the neighboring offices, like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole. It was so dense without that although the court was the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come dropping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by and was brewing on a large scale. The door to Scrooge's counting-house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who, in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so much smaller that it looked like 1 coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal-box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed.
A Merry Christmas, Uncle. God save you.
Humbug.
He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again.
Christmas, a humbug, Uncle. You don't mean that, I'm sure.
I do. Merry Christmas? What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough?
Come then, what right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough.
Bah, humbug.
Don't be cross, Uncle.
What else can I be? When I live in such a world of fools as this, Merry Christmas, out upon Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money, a time for finding yourself a year older but not an hour richer, a time for balancing your books and having every item in them through a round dozen of months presented dead against you. If I could work my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips would be boiled in his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should.
Uncle.
Nephew, keep Christmas in your own way and let me keep it in mine.
Keep it, but you don't keep it.
Let me leave it alone, then. Much good may it do you, much good as it ever done anybody.
There are many things from which I have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say. Christmas among the rest. But I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time when it has come around, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin. If anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say, God bless it.
The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire and extinguished the last frail spark forever.
Let me hear another sound from you, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir. I wonder that you don't go into Parliament.
Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow.
Scrooge said that he would see him. Yes, indeed he did. He went the whole length of the expression that said that he would see him in that extremity first.
But why? Why?
Why did you get married?
Because I fell in love.
Because you fell in love. Good afternoon.
Nay, Uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now?
Good afternoon.
I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?
Good afternoon.
I am sorry, with all my heart, to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel, to which I have been party, but I have made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humour to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, Uncle.
Good afternoon.
And a Happy New Year.
Good afternoon.
His nephew left the room without an angry word. Notwithstanding, he stopped at the outer door to bestow the greeting of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially. Scrooge?
Another fellow, my clerk with 15 shillings a week and a wife and family, talking about Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam.
This lunatic, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let two other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and paper in their hand, and bowed to him.
Scrooge and Marley's, I believe. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?
Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. He died 7 years ago, this very night.
We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner.
It certainly was, for they had been two kindred spirits at the ominous word liberality. Scrooge frowned and shook his head and handed the credentials back.
At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge, it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessities. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir.
Are there no prisons?
Plenty of prisons.
And the union workhouses, are they still in operation?
They are. Still. I wish I could say they were not.
The treadmill and the poor law in full vigor, then?
Both very busy, sir.
Oh, I was afraid from what you had said that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course. I'm very glad to hear it.
Under the impression that they scarcely furnish cheer of mind or body to the multitude, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and a means of warmth. We chose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?
Nothing.
You wish to be anonymous?
I wish to be alone. Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there.
Many can't go there, and many would rather die.
If they would rather die, they had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that.
But you might know it.
It's not my business. It's enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen.
Since seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentlemen withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labour with an improved opinion of himself, and a more facetious temper than was usual with him. Foggier yet and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. Nope, I messed up the thingy a bit. Yes, foggier yet and colder, piercer, searching, biting cold. If the good Saint Dustin had but nipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of such weather as that, instead of using his familiar weapons, then indeed he would have roared his lusty purpose. The owner of one scant young nose, gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold, as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol. But at the first sound of
God bless you, merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay.
Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more congenial frost. At length the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool, and tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat.
You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose?
It's quite convenient, sir.
It's not convenient, and it's not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound. And yet, you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work?
It's only once a year.
Poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December, but I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier next morning.
The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, went down a slide on Cornhill at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honour of it being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt to play at blind man's buff. Scrooge took his melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers, and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suit of rooms, in a lowering pile of building up a yard, where it had so little business to be there that one could scarcely help fancying it must have run there when it was a young house, playing at hide-and-seek with other houses, and forgotten the way out. It was old enough now, and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge. The fog and frost so hung about the black old gatehouse of the house, that it seemed as if the genius of the weather sat in the mournful meditation on the threshold. Now, it is a fact that there is nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. Also, as a fact, that Scrooge had seen it, night and morning, during his whole residence in that place, and also that Scrooge had as little of what is called fancy about him as any man in the city of London. Let it also be borne in mind that Scrooge had not yet bestowed one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. And then let any man explain to me, if he can, how it happened that Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face. It was not an impenetrable shadow as the other objects in the yard, but it had a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. And it was not angry or ferocious, but looked to Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on its ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred, as if by breath or hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. That and its livid color made it horrible, but its horror seemed to be in spite of the face and beyond its control rather than a part of its expression. As Scrooge looked fixedly at the phenomenon, it was a knocker again. To say that he was not startled, or that his blood was not conscious of the terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue. But he put his hand upon the key he had relinquished, turned it sturdily, walked in, and lighted his candle. He did pause with a moment's irresolution before he shut the door. He did look cautiously behind it, as if he had expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out in the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door except the screws and nuts that held the knocker, and so he said,
Who?
and closed it with a bang. Quite satisfied, he closed his door and locked himself in, double-locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his dressing gown and slippers, and his nightcap, sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed. Nothing on such a bitter night. He was obliged to sit close to it, and brood over it, before he could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. The fireplace was an old one, built by some Dutch merchant long ago, paved all around with quaint Dutch tiles designed to illustrate the Scriptures. Hundreds of figures to attract his thoughts, and yet the face of Marley, 7 years dead, came like an ancient prophet's rod, and swallowed up the whole. If each smooth tile had been a blank at first, with power to shape some pictures on its surface from disjointed fragments of his thoughts, they would be a copy of old Marley's head in every one.
Humbug.
And walked across the room. After several turns he sat down again. He threw his head back in the chair. His glance happened upon a bell, a disused bell, that hung in the room, and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked he saw the bell begin to swing. It swung so softly that the outset it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This might have lasted a minute, or half a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, together. They were succeeded by a loud clanking noise, deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. Scrooge then remembered to have heard that ghosts in haunted houses were described as dragging chains. The cellar door flew open with a booming sound, and then he heard a noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door.
It's humbug still. I won't believe it.
His color changed, though, when, without a pause, it came on through the heavy door. It passed into the room before his eyes. Upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up, as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost," and fell again. The same face, the very same, Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tight, and boots, the tassels on the latter bristling, like his pigtail and his coat skirts, and the hair upon his head. The chain he drew was clasped about the middle. It was long, and wound about him like a tail. And it was made, for Scrooge observed it closely, of cash boxes, keys, padlocks, ledgers, deeds, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was so transparent that Scrooge, observing him and looking through his waistcoat, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he had never believed it until now. No, nor did he believe it even now, though he looked the phantom through and through and saw it standing before him, though he felt the chilling influence of death cold and marked the very texture of the folded kerchief, bound about its head and chin, which wrapper he had not observed before. He was still incredulous and fought against his senses.
How now? What do you want from me?
Much.
Who are you?
Ask me who I was.
Who were you then? You're particular for a shade.
In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley. You don't believe me.
I don't.
What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses?
I don't know.
Why do you doubt your senses?
Because a little thing affects them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheese. You may be an undigested bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are.
Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart by any means waggish then. The truth is he tried to be smart, as a means of distracting his own attention, and keeping down his terror. For the spectre's voice disturbed the very marrow of his bones. To sit, staring at those fixed, glazed eyes, in silence for a moment, would play, Scrooge felt, the very deuce with him. There was something very awful, too, in the spectre's being provided with an infernal atmosphere of its own. Scrooge could not feel it himself, but this was clearly the case, for the ghost sat peacefully motionless, its hair and skirts and tassels were still agitated by the hot vapor from an oven.
You see this toothpick?
I do.
You are not looking at it.
But I see it.
Well, I have but to swallow this and be for the rest of my days persecuted by a legion of goblins, all of my own creation. Humbug, I tell you, humbug!
At this the spirit raised a fearful cry, and shook its chains with such a dismal and appalling noise, that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling into a swoon. Held on tight to his... But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking off the bandage round its head, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped upon its breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face.
Mercy! Dreadful apparition! Why trouble me?
Man of the worldly mind, do you believe in me or not?
I do. I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?
It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow man and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander the world, oh, woe is me, and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth and turned to happiness.
Again the spectre raised a cry and shook its chains and wrung its shadow hands.
You're fettered. Tell me why.
I wear the chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on my own free will, and my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?
Scrooge trembled more and more.
Or would you know the weight and length of the oil of the strong coil you bear yourself? It was full, as heavy, and as long as it is 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on it since. It is a ponderous chain.
Scrooge glanced about him on the floor, as if in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing.
Jacob. Old Jacob Marley, tell me, speak comfort to me, Jacob.
I have none to give. It comes from other regions, Ebenezer Scrooge, and is conveyed by other ministers to other kinds of men. Nor can I tell you what I would. A very little more is all permitted to me. I cannot rest, I cannot stay, I cannot linger anywhere. My spirit never walked beyond our counting house. Mark me, in life my spirit never roved beyond the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary journeys lie before me.
It was a habit with Scrooge, whenever he became thoughtful, to put his hands in his breeches pockets. Pondering what the ghost had said, he did so now, but without lifting up his eyes or getting off his knees.
You must have been very slow about it, Jacob.
Slow.
7 years dead, on traveling all the time?
The whole time. No rest, no peace, incessant torture of remorse.
You travel fast.
On the wings of the wind.
You might have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years.
The ghost, on hearing this, set up another cry, and clanked its chain so hideously in the dead silence of the night that the ward would have justified in indicting it for nuisance.
O captive, bound and double-ironed, not to know the ages of innocent labor by immortal creatures, for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit working kindly in its own little sphere, whatever it may be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. Not to know that no space of regret can make amends for one life's opportunity misused. Yet such was I, oh, such was I.
But you were always a good man of business, Jacob.
Business! Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were my business all. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in comprehensive oceans of my business.
It held up its chains at arm's length, as if that were the cause of all its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again.
At this time of the rolling year, I suffer most. But did I walk through the crowds of fellow beings with my eyes turned down and never raised them to the blessed star that led the wise men to their poor abode? Were there no poor homes to which this light would have conducted me?
Scrooge was very much dismayed to hear the spectre going on at this rate, and began to quake exceedingly.
Hear me. My time is nearly gone.
I will, but don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, Jacob, pray.
How is it that I appear before you in the shape that you can see me and I may not tell? I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day.
It was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow.
That is no light part of my penance. I am here tonight to warn you. You have yet a chance and a hope of escaping my fate. A chance and hope of my procuring, Ebenezer.
You were always a good friend to me. Thank you.
You will be haunted by 3 spirits.
Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob?
It is.
I think I'd rather not.
Without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow when the bell tolls 1.
Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over, Jacob?
Expect the second on the second night at the same hour, the third upon the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that, for your own sake, ye remember what passed between us.
When it had said these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. Scrooge knew this by the smart sound of its teeth made when the jaws were brought together with the bandage. He ventured to raise his eyes again, and found his supernatural visitor confronting him in an erect attitude, with its chain wound over and about its arm. The apparition walked backwards from him, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did. When they were within 2 paces of each other, Marley's ghost held up its hand, and warning him to come no nearer, Scrooge stopped. Not so much in obedience, but in surprise and fear, for on the raising of the hand, he became sensible of confused noise in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret. Wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge and floated out upon the bleak night. Scrooge followed to the window, desperate in his curiosity. He looked out. The air was full of phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, and moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few, if they had been guilty governments, were linked together. None were free. Many had been personally known to Scrooge in their lives. He had been quite familiar with one old ghost, in a white waistcoat with a monstrous iron safe attached to its ankle, who cried piteously at being unable to assist a wretched woman with an infant, whom it saw below upon a doorstep. The misery with them all was clearly that they sought to interfere for good in human matters and had lost the power forever. Whether these creatures faded into mist, or mist enshrouded them, he could not tell. But they and their spirits' voices faded together, and the night became as it had been when he walked home. Scrooge closed the window, and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double-locked, as he had locked it with his own hand, and the bolts were undisturbed. He tried to say humbug, but stopped at the first syllable. And being from the emotion he had undergone, or fatigues of the day, or his glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour, much in need of repose, he went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. That is stave 1. We're going to take a short break so we can stretch and that. So
We're all right. Are we out?
And it's us now. Someone needs to mute. Okay. Stave 2. First of the three spirits. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed he could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of his chamber. He was endeavoring to pierce the darkness with his ferret eyes when the chimes of a neighboring church struck the 4 quarters. He listened for the hour. To his great astonishment, the heavy bell went from 6 to 7, from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12. Then stopped. 12. It was past 2 when he went to bed. The clock was wrong. An icicle must have gotten into its works. 12. He touched the spring of his repeater to correct its most preponderous clock. Its rapid little pulse beat 12 and then stopped. But why? It isn't...
It is impossible that I can have slept through a whole day and far into another night. It is impossible that anything has happened to the sun, and this is 12 at noon.
Scrooge went to bed again and thought it over and over, and could make nothing of it. The more he thought, the more perplexed he was, and the more he endeavored not to think, the more he thought. Marley's ghost bothered him exceedingly. Every time he resolved within himself, after mature inquiry, that it was all a dream, and his mind flew back again, like a strong spring released to its first position, and presented the same problem, to be worked on all through.
Was it a dream or not?
Scrooge lay in this state until the chime had gone 3/4 more, and he remembered, on a sudden, that the ghost had warned him of a visitation when the bell tolled 1. He resolved to lie awake until the hour was past, and considering that he could no more sleep than go to heaven, this was perhaps the wisest resolution in his power. The quarter was so long that he had more than once convinced that it must have sunk into a doze unconscious, and missed the clock. At length it broke upon his listening ear. Ding!
Quarter past.
Ding!
Half past.
Ding!
Quarter to it.
Ding!
The hour itself. And nothing else.
He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it now did with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand. Not the curtains at his feet, nor the curtains at his back, but those to which his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge, starting up into a half-recumbent attitude, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them, as close to it as I am now to you, and I am standing in spirit at your elbow. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child, as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of having receded from the view, and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down at its back, was white, as if with age, yet his face had not a wrinkle on it, and the tenderest bloom was on the cheek. The eyes were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of more uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were, like those of the upper members, bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist bound with a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch fresh green holly in its hands, and in its singular contradiction with all that wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless the occasion of its using, in its duller moments, a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. Even this, though when Scrooge looked at it was with increasing steadiness, was not the strangest quality. For at its belt sparkled and glittered now in one part and now another, and what with light was one instant at another time was dark, so the figure itself fluctuated in its distinctness, now being a thing with one arm, now a thing with one leg, now a thing with 20 legs, now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body, of which dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away, and the very clear wonder of this, it would be itself again, distinct and clear as ever.
Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?
I am.
The voice was soft and gentle, singularly low, as if it, instead of being so close beside him, were at a distance.
Who and what are you?
I am the ghost of Christmas past.
Long past?
No, your past.
Perhaps Scrooge could not have told anybody why, if anybody could have asked him, but he had such a special desire to see the spirit in his cap and begged him to be covered.
What? Would you so soon put out with worldly hands the light I give? Is it not enough that you are one of those whose passions made this cap and forced me through whole trains of years to wear it low upon my brow?
Scrooge reverently disclaimed any intention to offend or any knowledge of having wilfully bonneted the spirit in any period of his life. He then made bold as to inquire what business had brought him there.
Your welfare.
Scrooge expressed himself much obliged, but could not help thinking that the night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end. The spirit must have heard him thinking, for it said immediately,
Your reclamation, then. Take heed.
It put out its strong hand as it spoke and clasped him gently by the arm.
Rise and walk with me.
It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that the bed was warm and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that his cap was lightly in his slippers and dressing gown and nightcap, that he had a cold upon him at that time. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, and finding that the spirit made towards the window, clasped his robe in supplication.
I am immortal and liable to fall.
There but a touch of my hand there, and you shall be upheld in more than this.
As the words were spoken, they passed through the wall and stood upon an old country road, with fields on either hand. The city had entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was clear, cold, wintry day, with snow upon the ground.
Good heaven! I was bred in this place. I was a boy here.
The spirit gazed upon him mildly, its gentle touch, though it had been light and spontaneous. That spirit still present to the old man's sense of feeling. He was conscious of 1,000 odors floating in the air, each one connected with 1,000 thoughts, hopes, joys, cares, long, long forgotten.
Your lip is trembling. And what is that upon your cheek?
Temple.
And begged the ghost to lead him where he would.
You recollect the way?
Remember it. I could walk it blindfolded.
Strange to have forgotten it for so many years. Let us go on.
They walked along the road. Scrooge recognized every gate and post and tree until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, its winding river. Some shaggy ponies now were trotting towards them, with boys on their backs, calling to other boys in country gigs and carts driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits and shouted to each other until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it.
These are but shadows of the things that have been. They have no consciousness of us.
The jocund travellers came on, and as they came, Scrooge knew and named them every one. Why, he rejoiced beyond all bounds to see them. Why did his cold eyes glisten, and his heart leap up as they went past? Why was he filled with a gladness when he heard them give each other Merry Christmas? And they parted at crossroads and byways for their several homes. What was Merry Christmas to Scrooge? Out upon Merry Christmas! What good had it ever done him?
The school was not quite deserted. A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still.
I know it.
They left the high road, and by a well-remembered lane, soon approached a mansion of dull red brick, with little weathercocks mounted its cupola. On the roof, and a bell was hanging in it, was a large house, but one of broken fortunes, for the spacious offices were little used. The walls were damp and mossy, the windows broken, the gates decayed. There was an earthly savour in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associates itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight and not much to eat. They went, the Scrooge and Ghost, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before them and disclosed a long, bare, melancholy room, much mirrored still by lines of plain deal forms and desks. At one of these, a lonely boy was reading near a feeble fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a form and wept to see his poor forgotten self as he used to be. Not a ladened echo in the house, not a squeak, not a scuffle from the mouse behind the panelling, not a drip from the half-thawed water-spout in the dull yard behind, not a sigh among the leafless boughs of the one despondent poplar, not the idle swinging of the empty storehouse door. No, not the clicking in the fire, but fell upon the heart of Scrooge with a softening influence, and gave a freer passage to his tears.
I wish, but it's too late now.
What's the matter?
Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should like to have given him something, that's all.
The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand, saying as it did so,
Let us see another Christmas.
Scrooge's former self grew larger at the words, and the room became a little darker and more dirty. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell of the ceiling. How this all came about, Scrooge knew not. He only knew it was quite correct, that everything had happened so, and that there he was, alone again, when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost, and with a mournful shaking of his head, glanced anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in, putting her arms about his neck, and kissing him, addressing him as her
Dear brother, I have come to bring you home, dear brother, to bring you home, home, home.
Home, little friend?
Yes, home for good and all, home forever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be, but home's like heaven. He spoke so gently to me one dear night when I was going to bed, but I was not afraid to ask him once more if he might come home. And he said, yes, you should, and sent me in a coach to bring you. And you're to be a man, and are never to come back here. But first, we're to be together all the Christmas long, and have the merriest time in all the world.
You are quite a woman, little friend.
She clapped her hands and laughed, and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again and stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door, and he, nothing loath to go, accompanied her.
Always a delicate creature whom a breath might have withered, but she had a large heart.
So she had. You're right. I will not gainsay it, Spirit. God forbid.
She died a woman, and had, as I think, children.
One child.
True. Your nephew.
Yes.
Although they had but that moment left the school behind them, they were now in the busy thoroughfares of the city, where shadowy passengers passed and repassed, where shadowy carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of a real city were it was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here, too, it was Christmas time. But it was evening, and the streets were lighted up. The ghost stopped at a certain warehouse door and asked Scrooge if he knew it.
Know it? Was I apprenticed here?
They went in, a sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind a high desk, that if he had been 2 inches taller he might have knocked his head against the ceiling. Scrooge cried in great excitement,
Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again.
Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself from his shoes to the organ of his benevolence, and called out in a comfortable, oily, rich, fat, jovial voice,
Yo-ho there, Ebenezer. Dick.
Scrooge's former self, now a grown young man, came bristling in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice.
Dick Wilkins, to be sure. Bless me, yes, there he is. He was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick. Dear, dear.
Yo-ho, my boys. No more work tonight. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up, before a man can say Jack Robinson.
You wouldn't believe how those two fellows were at it. They charged into the street with the shutters, 1, 2, 3, and held 'em up in place. 4, 5, 6, barred 'em and pinned 'em. 7, 8, 9, they came back before you could have got to 12, panting like racehorses.
Hilly-ho. Clear away, my lads, and let's have lots of room here. Hilly-ho, Dick. Cheer up, Ebenezer.
Clear away, there was nothing they would have cleared away, or couldn't have cleared away, with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off, as if it were dismissed from public life for evermore. The floor was swept and watered, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire, and the warehouse was as snug and as warm and as dry, and as bright as a ballroom, as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler with a music book, and went to the lofty desk, and made an orchestra of it, and turned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers, whose hearts they would break. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the housemaid, with her cousin, the baker. In came the cook, with his brother's particular friend. In came the boy from over the way, who was expected of not having been bored enough for his master, trying to hide himself behind the girl from next door but one, who was proved to have had her ears pulled by her mistress. In they all came, one after the other, some shyly, some boldly, some graceful, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they came, anyhow and everyhow. Away they went, 20 couples at once, hands round and back, again the other way, down the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping. Old top couple always turning up in the wrong place, new top couple starting off again, and as soon as they got there, all top couples at last, and not a bottom one to help them. When this result was brought about, old Fezziwig clapped his hands to stop the dance, and cried out,
Well done.
And the fiddler plunged his hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for that purpose. But scorning rest upon his reappearance, he instantly began again, and though there were no dancers yet, as if the other fiddler had all been carried home, exhausted on the shutter, and he was a brand new man resolved to beat him out of sight or perish. There were more dances and more forfeits. There was cake, there was negus, there was a great piece of cold roast, and there was a great piece of boiled roast. There was mince pies and plenty of beer. The great effect of the eating came after the roast and boiled, when the fiddler, an artful dog, mind, the sort of man who knew his business better than you or I could have told it to him, struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. Then old Fezziwig stood up to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig, top couple too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them. 3 or 4, 20 pairs of partners, people who would not be trifled with, people who would dance, and had no notion of walking. But there had been twice as many, 4. Old Fezziwig would have been a match for them, and so would Miss Fezziwig. As to her, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. If that's not high praise, tell me higher, and I'll use it. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. You couldn't have predicted at any given time what would have become of them next. When old Fezziwig and Mrs. Fezziwig had all gone through the dance, advance and retire, both hands to your partner, bow and curtsy, corkscrew, thread the needle, and back again to your place. Fezziwig cut so deftly that he appeared to wink with his legs, and came upon his feet again without a stagger. When the clock struck 11, the domestic ball broke up. During Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig went out and wished him and her a Merry Christmas when everyone had retired but the two prentices. They did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which under a counter in the back shop. During this whole time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self. He corroborated everything, and remembered everything, enjoyed everything, underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, with the bright faces of his former self and Dick were turned from him, that he remembered the ghost, and became conscious that it was looking full upon him, when the light upon its head burnt very clear.
No matter, to make these silly folks so full of gratitude.
Small.
The spirit assigned to him to listen to the two apprentices, who were pouring their hearts out in praise of Fezziwig, and when he had done so, he said,
Why, is it not? He has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?
It isn't that. It isn't that, spirit. He has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. Say that his power lies in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it is impossible to add and count him up. What then? The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune.
What's the matter?
Nothing particular.
Something, I think.
No, I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now, that's all.
His former self turned down the lamps as he gave utterance to the wish, and Scrooge and Ghost stood side by side in the open air.
My time grows short. Quick!
This was not addressed to Scrooge, or to anyone who could see it, but it was produced an immediate effect, for again Scrooge saw himself. He was older now, and man in the prime of his life. His face was not the harsh, rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of care and avarice. There was an eager, greedy, restless motion to the eyes, which showed the passion that had taken root, where the shadows of the growing tree would fall. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a mourning dress, in whose eyes there were tears, which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past.
Matters little, to you very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come, as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve.
What idol has displaced you?
The golden one.
This is the even-handed dealing of the world. There is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty, and there is nothing it professes to condemn with such severity as the pursuit of wealth.
You fear the world too much. All your other hopes have merged into the hope of being beyond the chance of its sordid reproach. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you. Have I not?
What then? Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I'm not changed towards you. Am I?
Our contract is an old one. It was made when we were both poor and content to be so, until in good season we could improve our worldly fortune by our patient industry. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man.
I was a boy.
Your own feeling tells you that you are not what you are. I am. That which promised happiness when we were one in heart is fraught with misery now that we are two. How often and how keenly have I thought of this, I will not say. It is enough that I have thought of it and can release you.
Have I ever sought release?
In words? No, never.
In what, then?
In a changed nature, in an altered spirit, in another atmosphere of life, another hope as its great end, in everything that made my love of any worth or value in your sight. If this had never been between us, tell me, would you seek me out and try to win me now? No.
You think not.
I would gladly think otherwise if I could. Heaven knows. When I have learned a truth like this, I know how strong and irresistible it must be. But if you are free today, tomorrow, and yesterday, can even I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl? You, who in your very confidence with her weigh everything by gain, or choosing her, if for a moment you were false enough to your one guiding principle to do so, do I not know that your repentance and regret would surely follow? I do, and I release you, with the full heart, for the love of him you once were. You may. The memory of what is past half makes me hope you will have pain in this. A very, very brief time, and you will dismiss the recollection of it gladly, as an unprofitable dream from which it happened well that you woke. May you be happy in the life you have chosen.
She left him and they parted.
Spirit, show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight to torture me?
I told you these were shadows of things that have been. That they are what they are. Don't blame me.
Remove me. I cannot bear it.
He turned upon the ghost, and seeing that it looked upon him with a face, in which some strange way that there were fragments of all the faces it had shown him, wrestled with it.
Leave me. Take me back. Haunt me no longer.
In this struggle, if that can be called a struggle in which the ghost, with no visible resistance on its own part, was undisturbed by any effort of its adversary, Scrooge observed that the light was burning low and bright, and dimly connecting that this was its influence over him, he seized the extinguisher cap, and by a sudden action pressed it down upon its head. The spirit dropped beneath it, so that the extinguisher covered its whole form. But though Scrooge pressed it down with all his force, he could not hide the light, which streamed from under it, and in unbroken flood upon the ground. He was conscious of it being exhausted and overcome by irresistible drowsiness, and further, of being in his own bedroom. He gave the cap a parting squeeze, in which his hands relaxed, and he had barely time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. That was stave 2. Curtain calls for everyone. That was great. So we're going to take another quick break so everybody can stretch and drink water and the like. And then we will be back with stave 3. So we're just about to get underway with stave 3. You can see the cast list. I made a mistake. Jack is in fact the ghost of Christmas Present. But yeah, there we go. There's everybody who's in this chapter. Oh, and yes, we have a brief cameo from Kathy as well. Awaking in the middle of a prodigious tough snore and sitting up in bed to get to his thoughts together, Scrooge had no occasion to be told that the bell was again upon the stroke of 1. He felt that, and he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time for the especial purpose of holding a conference with the second messenger dispatched to him through Jacob Marley's interference. But finding that he had turned uncomfortably cold, when he began to wonder which of his curtains this new spectre would draw back, he put them every one aside with his own hands, and laying down, established a sharp lookout all round the bed, for he wished to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance, and did not wish to be taken by surprise. Now being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing, and consequently when the bell struck 1 and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. All this time he lay upon his bed, the very core and centre of a blaze of ruddy light, which streamed upon it when the clock proclaimed the hour, and which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as he was powerless to make out what it meant, or would be at, was sometimes apprehensive that he might by that very moment in an interesting case of spontaneous combustion, without having the consolation of knowing it. At last, however, he began to think, as you or I would have thought at first, for it is always a person not in the predicament who knows what ought to have been done in it, and would unquestionably have done it too. At last, I say, he began to think that the source and secret of this ghastly light might be in the adjoining room, from whence, on further tracing it, it seemed to shine. The idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by name, and bade him enter. He obeyed. It was his own room. There was no doubt about that, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceilings were hung with a living green, that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light, as if so many little mirrors had been scattered there, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney, as that dull petrification of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or Marley's, or for many, many winter seasons gone. He heaped up on the floor to form a kind of throne, where turkeys, geese, game, poultry, brawn, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum pudding, barrels of oyster, red-hot chestnuts, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12 cakes, and seething bowls of punch, that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch, in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it up high, to shed its light on Scrooge, as he came peeping round the door.
Come in and know me better, man.
Scrooge entered timidly, and hung his head before the spirit. He was not the dogged Scrooge he had been, and though the spirit's eyes were clear and kind, he did not like to meet them.
I am the ghost of Christmas Present. Look upon me.
Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple green robe, or mantle bordered with white fur. The scarlet hung so loosely on its figure that the capricious breast was bare, as if it disdained to be warded or concealed by any artifice. Its feet, observed beneath an ample fold of the garments, were also bare, and its head wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls, its bright red curls were long and free as its genial voice, its sparkling eye, its open hand, its cheery voice, its unconstrained demeanor, its joyful air. Girded round its middle was an antique scabbard. No sword was in it, and the ancient sheath was eaten up with rust.
You have never seen the like of me before.
Never.
I've never walked forth with the younger members of my family, meaning for I am very young. My elder brother's born in these later years.
I don't think I have. I'm afraid I have not. Have you many brothers, Spirit?
More than 1,800.
Tremendous family to provide for. Spirit, conduct me where you will. I went forth last night on compulsion, and I learned a lesson, which is working now. Tonight, if you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it.
Touch my robe.
Scrooge did it he was told, and held it fast. Holly, mistletoe, berries, red berries, ivy, turkey, geese, game, poultry, brawn, meat, instantly vanished. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, the hour of night, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning, where, for the weather was severe, the people made rough, but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music, in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings, and from the top of their houses, whence it was a mad delight to see the boys to come to see it plummeting down into the road below and splitting into artificial little snowstorms. The house fronts looked black enough, and the windows blacker, contrasting with the smooth white sheet of snow upon the roofs, and with the dirtier snow upon the ground, which last deposit had been ploughed up in deep furrows of the heavy wheels of carts and wagons, furrows that crossed and recrossed each other hundreds of times, where the great streets branched off and made intricate channels, hard to trace in the thick yellow mud and icy water. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choking up with a dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, whose heavier particles descended in a shower of sooty atoms, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had by one consent caught fire, and there was nothing blazing away to the heart's content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate of the town, and yet there was an air of cheerfulness abroad, that the clearest summer air and brightest summer sun might have endeavored to diffuse in vain. For the people who were shoveling away at the housetops were jovial and full of glee, calling out to each other from the parapets, and now and then exchanging a facetious snowball. Better-natured missiles far than many a worldly jest, laughing heartily if it went right, and not less heartily if it went wrong. The poulterers' shops were still half open, and the fruiterers were radiant in glory. The grocers nearly closed, with perhaps 2 shutters down, or 1, but through the gaps such glimpses, it was not alone that the scales descended on the counter were made a merry sound, or that the twine and roller purred company so briskly, or that the canisters were rattled up and down like juggling tricks, or even that the blended scents of tea and coffee were made grateful to the nose, or even that the raisins were plentiful and rare, the almonds so extremely white, the sticks of cinnamon long and straight. I lost my place. Nor was it that the figs were moist and plumpy, or that the French plums brushed in modest tartness from their highly decorated boxes, or that everything was good to eat and in its Christmas dress, but the customers were all so hurried and eager in the hopeful promise of the day that they tumbled up against each other at the door, crashing their wicker baskets wildly, and left their purchases upon the counter, come running back to fetch them, and committed hundreds of like little mistakes, in the best humor possible, while the grocer and his people were so frank and fresh that the polished hearts with which they fastened their aprons behind might have been their own, worn outside for general inspection, and for Christmas daws to peck as they chose. But soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they went, came flocking through the streets in their best clothes and with their gayest faces. and at the same time there emerged from the scores of by-streets, lanes, and nameless turning innumerable people carrying their dinners to the bakers' shops. The sight of these poor revellers appeared to interest the spirit very much, for he stood with Scrooge beside him in the baker's doorway, and taking off the cover as their bearers passed, sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch. And it was a very uncommon kind of torch, for once or twice, when there were angry words between some dinner carriers who jostled each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humour restored directly. For they said it was a shame to quarrel on Christmas Day, and so it was, God love it, and so it was. In time the bells ceased, and the bakers were shut up, and there was a genial shadowing forth of all these dinners, and the progress of their cooking in the thawed botches of wet above each baker's oven, where the pavement smoked as if its stones were cooking too. Ugh.
Is there a peculiar flavor in what you sprinkle from your torch?
There is, my own.
Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day?
To any kindly given to a poor one most.
Why to a poor one most?
Because it needs it most.
It was a remarkable quality of the ghost which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully and like a supernatural creature as was possible as he could have done in a lofty hall. And perhaps it was the pleasure the good spirit had in showing off this power of his, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men, that led him straight to Scrooge's clerk's house. For there he went, and took Scrooge with him, holding on to his robe. And on the threshold of the door, the spirit smiled, and stopped to bless Rob Cratchit's dwelling, with the sprinkling of his torch. Think of that! Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-roomed house. Then rose up Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for 6pence. And she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, getting the corner of his monstrous shirt-collar. Bob's private property conferred upon his son an heir in honour of the day, into his mouth, rejoicing to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now the 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose, and known it for their own. And basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these Cratchits danced about the table, exalting Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud, although his collar nearly choked him, blew on the fire until the slow potatoes bubbling knocked loudly on the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled.
What has ever got your precious father then, and your brother Tiny Tim, and Martha wasn't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour?
Here's Martha, Mother.
Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are!
We had a deal of work to finish up last night and had to clear away this morning, Mother.
Well, never mind, so long as you are come. Sit you down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm, Lord bless ye.
No, there's Father coming. Hide, Martha, hide.
So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter exclusively of the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed, to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame.
Why, where's our Martha?
Not coming.
Not coming?
Bob with sudden declination in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church, and had come home rampant.
Not coming upon Christmas Day?
Martha didn't like to see his disappointment, if it were only a joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off to the wash-house, that he might see the pudding singing in the copper.
How did little Tim behave?
As good as gold, and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see.
Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brothers and sisters to the stool before the fire. Sorry, my notes. Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table and with the handle of his knife, and feebly cried, "Hurrah!"
There never was such a goose.
Its tenderness and flavor and size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration, eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, and it was sufficient dinner for the whole family indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight. But now the plates were being changed by Miss Belinda. Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in.
Oh, and a wonderful pudding. The greatest success ever achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since our marriage.
Mrs. Cratchit said now the weight was off her mind, she would confess she had her doubts about the quality of the flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought that it was such a small pudding for so large a family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the house made up. Then Bob proposed.
A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us.
Which the family re-echoed.
God bless us, everyone.
He said Tiny Tim. He sat very close to his father's side, upon a little stool. Bob held his withered hand in his, as if he loved the child, and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him.
Spirit, tell me if Tiny Tim will live.
I see a vacant seat in the poor chimney corner, and a crotch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die.
No, oh no, kind spirit, say he will be spared.
If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus of population. If man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live, what men shall die? It may be that in the sight of heaven, you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child. Oh God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on the too much life among his hungry brothers in the dust.
Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground, but raised them speedily on hearing his own name.
Mr. Scrooge, I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast.
A founder of the feast, indeed. I wish I had him here. I'd give a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it.
My dear, the children, Christmas Day.
It should be Christmas Day, I am sure, on which one drinks the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do, my poor fellow.
My dear, Christmas Day.
I'll drink his health for your sake, and the day's, not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt.
The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings, which had no heartiness. Tiny Tim drank the last of all, but he didn't care tuppence for it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof. Their clothes were scanty. And Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded, and looked happier yet in the bright sprinkling of the Spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim until the last. By this time it was getting dark and snowing pretty heavily, and as Scrooge and the Spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in the kitchen parlours and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze showed preparations for dinner, with hot plates baking through and before the fires, and deep red curtains ready to be drawn to shut out the cold and darkness. There all the children of the house were running into the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, aunts, uncles, and to be the first to greet them. Here again were the shadows on the window blind of guests assembling. And there were groups of handsome girls, all hooded and fur-booted, and all chattering at once, tripping lightly off to some near neighbour's house, where woe upon the single man who saw them enter. Artful witches, when they knew it in a glow. But if you had judged from the numbers of people on their way to friendly greetings, you might have thought that there was no one at home to give welcome when they got there. Instead of every house expecting company and piling up its fires half chimney high, blessings on it, and how the ghost exulted, how it bared its breadth of breast, and opened its capacious palm, and floated on, outpouring with a generous hand, its bright harmless mirth on everything within its reach. The very lamplighter who ran on before dotted the dusty street with flecks of light, and who was dressed to spend the evening somewhere, laughed out loudly as the Spirit passed, though little knew the lamplighter that he had any company but Christmas. It was... And Scrooge... Then they go traveling. It was much great surprise to Scrooge to hear a laugh. He recognized his own nephews, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the Spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at the same nephew with approving affability. If you should happen, by any unlikely chance, to know a man with a more blessed-in laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is I should like to know him. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. It is a fair, even-handed, noblest of things, that while there is infection of disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humour. When Scrooge's nephew laughed in all this way, and holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends being not behindhand, roared out lustily.
He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I lived. He believed it too.
Poor shame for him, Fred.
said Scrooge's niece indignantly. Bless these women, they never do anything by halves. They are always in earnest.
He's a comical old fellow, that's the truth, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him.
I'm sure he is very rich, Fred. At least you always tell me so.
What of that, my dear? His wealth is of no use to him. He don't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking, ha ha, that he is ever going to benefit us with it.
I have no patience with him.
And all the other ladies expressed the same opinion.
Oh, I have. I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here he takes it into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner.
Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner.
Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had the dinner, and with the dessert upon the table were clustered round the fire by lamplight.
Do go on, Fred. He never finishes what he begins to say. He is such a ridiculous fellow.
I was only going to say that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, as I think, that he loses some pleasant moments, which could do him no harm. I am sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his moldy old office or his dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him if he finds me in good temper year after year and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If it only puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. Can I think I shook him yesterday?
It was their turn now to laugh at the notion of him shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, so that they laughed at any rate, he encouraged them in their merriment, and passed the bottle joyously. After tea they had some music, for they were a musical family. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, played among other tunes a simple little air, a mere nothing you might learn to whistle it in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. When this strain of music sounded, all the things the ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often, years ago, he might have cultivated the kindnesses of life for his own sake, for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton's spade, the buried Jacob Marley. But the whole scene passed off in the breath, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went, and many houses they visited, but always with a happy end. The spirits stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful, on foreign lands, and they were close at home. By struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope. By poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, in hospital, in jail, in misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the spirits out, he left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, but it was only one night, but Scrooge had his doubts because of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into a space of time they passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew older, clearly older. Scrooge observed this change, but never spoke of it, until they left a children's 12th night party, when he looked at the spirit and as they stood together in an open place, and he noticed that its hair was grey.
Spirit's lives so short.
My life upon this globe is very brief. It ends tonight.
Tonight?
Tonight at midnight, hark! The time is drawing near.
The chimes were ringing the 11:15 at that moment.
Forgive me if I'm not justified in what I ask, but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts. Is it a foot? Or a claw?
It might be a claw, for the flesh there is upon it. Was the spirit's sorrowful reply, "Look here."
From the folding of its robes it brought forth 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clung to the outside of its garments.
"Oh man, look here, look, down here."
They were a boy and girl, yellow, meager, scowling, wolfish, but prostrate too in their humility, where graceful youth should have filled their features out and touched them with the freshest tints. A stale and shriveled hand, like that of age, had pinched and twisted them, and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked, and glared out menacingly. No change, no degradation, no perversion of humanity, in any grade, through all the miseries of wonderful creation, had monsters half so horrible and dread. Scrooge started back, appalled. Having them shown him in this way, he tried to say that they were fine children. But the words choked themselves, rather than be parties to a lie of such enormous magnitude.
Spirit, are they yours?
They are man's, and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware them both, and all of their degree. But most of all, beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doomed, unless the writing be erased. Deny it. Slander those who tell it ye, admit for your factious purposes, and make it worse, and abide the end.
Have they no refuge or resource?
Are there no prisons? Are there no workhouses?
The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost and saw it not. As the last stroke ceased to vibrate, he remembered the predictions of old Jacob Marley, and lifting his eyes beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground towards him. And we will take a break with before the last of the spirits join us in the 4th stave. Okay. Stave 4, The Last of the Spirits. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which the spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and misery. It was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible save one outstretched hand. But for this it would have been difficult to detach its figure from the night, and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. He felt that it was tall and stately when it came beside him, and that its mysterious presence filled him with a solemn dread. He knew no more, for the spirit neither spoke nor moved.
I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come.
The spirit answered not, but pointed onward with its hand.
You are about to show me shadows of the things that have not happened, but will happen in the time before us. Is that so, Spirit?
The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer he received. Although well used to ghostly company by this time, Scrooge feared the silent shape so much that his legs trembled beneath him, and he found that he could hardly stand when he was prepared to follow it. The spirit paused for a moment, as observing his condition and giving him time to recover. But Scrooge was all the worse for this. It thrilled him with a vague, uncertain horror to know that behind that dusky shroud there were ghostly eyes intently fixed upon him, while he, though he stretched his own to the utmost, could see nothing but a spectral hand and one great heap of black.
Ghost of the future, I fear you more than any spectre I have seen, but as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear you company and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?
It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them.
Lead on, lead on. The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit.
The phantom moved away as if it came towards him. Scrooge followed in the shadow of its dress, which bore him up, he thought, and carried him along. They scarcely seemed to enter the city. The city rather seemed to spring around them, encompass them of its own act. But there they were, at the heart of it, on change among the merchants, who hurried up and down, and clinked the money in their pockets, and conversed in groups, and looked at their watches, and trifled thoughtfully with their own great gold seals, and so forth, as Scrooge had seen them often. Their spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. Observing that the hand was pointed to them, Scrooge advanced and listened to the talk.
No! I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead.
When did he die?
Last night, I believe.
Why, what was the matter with him? I thought he'd never die.
God knows.
What has he done with his money?
I haven't heard. Left to his company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know.
Scrooge was inclined to be surprised that the spirit should attach importance to the conversations apparently so trivial, but feeling assured that they must have some hidden purpose, he set himself to consider what it was likely to be. They could scarcely be supposed to have any bearing on the death of Jacob, his old partner, for that was past, and this ghost's province was the future. Nor could he think of anyone immediately connected with himself, to whom he could apply them. He looked about that place for his own image. But nothing doubted that whoever they applied to had some latent moral for his own improvement. He resolved to treasure up every word he heard, and everything he saw, and especially to observe the shadow of himself when it appeared. He looked about in that very place for his own image, but another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed at his usual time of day for being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitude that poured in through the porch. It gave him little surprise, however, for he had been resolved in his mind to change of life, and thought he hoped to see his new-born resolution carried out. Quiet and dark beside him stood the phantom with its outstretched hands. When he raised himself from this thoughtful quest, he fancied from turn of its hand and its situation in reference to himself that the unseen eyes were looking at him keenly. It made him shudder and feel very cold. They left the busy scene and went to an obscure part of town, which Scrooge had never penetrated before, although he recognized its situation and its bad repute. The ways were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people half-naked, drunken, slipshod, angry. Alleys and archways, they, like so many cesspools, disgorged their offices of smell and dirt and life upon the straggling street, and the whole quarter reeked with crime, with filth, with misery. Far in this den of infamous resort, there was low-browed beetling shop, below a penthouse roof, where iron, old rags, bottles, bones, and greasy offal were bought. Upon the floor were piled heaps of rusty keys, nails, chains, hinges, files, scales, weights, and refuse of iron of all kinds. Secrets that were few were like to scrutinize were bred and hidden in mountains of unseemly rags, masses of corrupted fat and spultures of bone, sitting in among the wares he dealt in. By a charcoal stove made of old bricks was a grey-haired rascal, nearly 70 years of age, who would screen himself from the cold air without by a frowsy curtain of miscellaneous tatters, hung upon a line, and smoked his pipe in a luxury of calm retirement. Scrooge and the Phantom came into the presence of this man just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into the shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in too, and was closely followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the recognition of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, they all three burst into a laugh.
Let the chairwoman alone to be first. Let the laundress alone to be second. Let the undertaker man alone to be third. Look here, Joe. Here's a chance. If you hadn't all three met here without meaning it.
You couldn't have met me in a better place. Come into the parlor. You were made free of it long ago, you know, and the other two ain't strangers. Stop till I shut the door of the shop. Ah, how it squeaks. There ain't a rusty bit of metal in the place. Its own hinges, I believe, and I'm sure there's no such bones here as mine. We're all suitable to our calling. We're all matched. Come into the parlor. Come into the parlor.
The parlor was a space behind the screen of rags. The old man raked the fire together with an old stair-rod, and having trimmed his smoky lamp, for it was night, with the stem of his pipe, put it in his mouth again. While he did this, the woman who had already spoken threw her bundle on the floor, and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool, crossing her elbows on her knees, and looking with a bold fierceness at the other two.
What the odds, then? What the odds, Mr. Dilbert? Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did.
That's true indeed. No man more so.
Why then don't you stand staring as if you were afraid, woman? Who is wiser? We're not going to pick the holes in each other's coats, I suppose?
No, indeed. We should hope not.
Very well, then. That's enough. Who's the worse the loss in a few things like these? Not the dead man, I suppose.
No, indeed.
If he wants to keep him after he's dead, the wicked old screw, why hasn't the nature of his life, if he had been, he'd have somebody to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping out in the last there, alone by himself?
It's the truest word that ever was spoke. It's a judgment on him.
I wish it was a little heavier than judgment, and it should have been. You may depend upon it. If I could have laid my hands on anything else, open the bundle, old Joe. Let me know the value of it. Speak it out plain. I'm not afraid to be the first, nor afraid of them to see it. Who knew pretty well that we were helping ourselves before we met here, I believe. It's no spin. Open the bundle, Joe.
But the gallantry of her friends would not allow this, and the man in faded black, mounting the breech first, produced his plunder. It was not extensive, a seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no value at all. There were several examined and appraised by old Joe, who chalked the sums he was disposed to give for each upon the wall, then added them up to total what he found there was nothing more to come.
That is your account, and I wouldn't give another sixpence if I were to be boiled for not doing it. Who's next?
Mrs. Dibler was next. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated on the wall in the same manner.
I always give too much, ladies. It's a weakness of mine, and that's the way I ruin myself. That's your account. If you asked me for another penny and made it an open question, I'd repent of being so liberal and knock off half a crown.
And now undo my bundle, Joe.
Joe went down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening it, and having fastened a great many knots, dragged out a large and heavy roll of some dark stuff.
What do we call this? Bed curtains.
Bed curtains.
You don't mean to say you took them down, rings and all, with him lying there?
I certainly shan't hold my hand when I can get any in by reaching in and out for the sake of such a man as he was. I promise you, Joe. Don't drop that oil upon the blanket now.
His blankets?
Who else do you think? He isn't likely to take cold without him, I dare say.
I hope he didn't die of anything catching, eh?
Don't you be afraid of that. I ain't so fond of his company, and I'm a loiter about him for such things. And if I did, you may look through that shirt till your eyes ache. But you won't find a hole in it, nor a tread place, it's the best that he had, and the fine one too. They've wasted it, and if it hadn't been for me.
What do you call wasting of it?
Putting it on him to be buried in, to be sure. Somebody was a fool enough to do that, but I took it off again. If calico ain't good enough for such a purpose, it ain't good enough for anything. It's quite as becoming to the body. He can't look uglier than he did in that one.
Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror, as they sat grouped about their spoil in the scanty light afforded by the old man's lamp. He viewed them with a detestation and disgust, which could hardly have been greater, though they had been obscene demons marketing the corpse itself.
This is the end of it, you see. He frightened everyone away from him when he was alive to profit us when he was dead. Ha, ha, ha.
Spirit, I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heaven, what is this?
He recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed, and now he was almost touching a bed. A bare, uncurtained bed, on which, beneath a ragged sheet, there lay something covered, which, though it was dumb, announced itself in awful language. The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy, though Scrooge glanced round it in obedience to a secret impulse, anxious to know what kind of room it was. A pale light, rising from the outer air, fell straight upon the bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of this man. Scrooge glanced toward the phantom, its steady hand pointed at the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face. He thought of it, felt how easy it would be to do, and longed to do it, but had no more power to withdraw the veil than to dismiss the spectre at his side.
Spirit, this is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson. Trust me, let us go. I understand you, and I would do it if I could, but I have not the power. Spirit, I have not the power.
Again it seemed to look on him.
Let me see some tenderness connected with death.
The ghost conducted him through several streets familiar to his feet, and as they went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. They entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling he had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were as still as statues in one corner, and sat looking up at Peter, who had had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet.
And he took a child and set him in the midst of them.
Where had Scrooge heard those words? Had he not dreamed them? The boy must have read them out as he and the spirit crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? The mother laid her work upon the table and put her hand to her face. Muted.
The color hurts my eyes.
The color? Ah, poor Tiny Tim.
They're better now again. It makes them weak by candlelight. I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. It must be near his time.
Mother, I think he has walked a little slower than he used these few last evenings, Mother.
They were very quiet again. At last she said in a cheerful voice that only faltered once. I've known him to walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder, very fast indeed.
So have I, often.
And so have I, exclaimed another. So had all. But he was very light to carry, and his father loved him so that it was no trouble. No trouble. And there's your father at the door. She hurried out to meet him, and little Bob, in his comforter, he had no need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried who should help him to it most. Then the two young Cratchits got onto his knees, and laid each child a little cheek against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, father, don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them, and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table, and praised the industry and speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. They would be done long before Sunday, he said. Sunday? You went today, then, Robert?
Yes, my dear. I wish you could have gone. Would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child. My little child.
They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and mother working still. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew, who he had scarcely seen but once, and who, in meeting him in the street that day and seeing that he looked just a little down, you know.
Just a little down, you know. On which, for he is the most pleasantest spoken gentleman you've ever heard, I told him. I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit, he said, and heartily sorry for your good wife. By the by, how he even knew that, I don't know.
Knew what, my dear?
Why, that you were a good wife.
Everybody knows that.
Very well observed, my boy. I hope they do. Heartily sorry, he said, for your good wife. If I can be of service to you in any way, he said, giving me his card, that's where I live. Pray come to me. Now, it wasn't for the sake of anything he might be able to do for us so much as for this kind way, that this was quite delightful. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim and felt with us.
I'm sure he's a good soul.
You would be sure of it, my dear, if you saw and spoke to him. Shouldn't be at all surprised. Mark what I say, if you got Peter in a better situation.
Only hear that, Peter.
And then, cried one of the girls, Peter will be keeping company with someone and setting up for himself.
Get along with you.
It's just as likely as not. One of these days, though there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however and whenever we part from one another, I'm sure we shall none of us meet him, shall we? Or this first parting that there was among us.
Never, Father.
And I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient, how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily among ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it.
No, never, Father.
I am very happy. I'm very happy.
Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, and his daughters kissed him. The two young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter and himself shook hands. Spirit of Tiny Tim, thy childish essence was from God.
Spectre, something informs me that our parting moment is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me, what man that was whom we saw lying dead?
The ghost of Christmas yet to come conveyed him, as before, through a different time. He thought, indeed, there was no order in these latter visions, save that they were in the future. Into the resorts of businessmen, but showed not himself. Indeed, the spirit did not stay for anything, but went straight on, as to the end just now desired, until he besought by Scrooge to tarry for a moment.
This court, though through which we hurry now, is where my place of occupation is, and has been for a length of time. I see the house. Let me behold what I shall be in days to come.
The spirit stopped, and the hand was pointed elsewhere.
The house is yonder. Why do you point away?
The exhonorable finger underwent no change. Scrooge hastened to the window of his office, and looked in. It was an office still, but not his. The furniture was not the same. The figure in the chair was not himself. The phantom pointed as before. He joined in once again, and wondered why and whither he had gone. Accompanied it until they reached an iron gate. He paused to look around before entering. A churchyard. Here, then, the wretched man whose name he had now to learn lay underneath the ground. It was a worthy place, walled in by the houses, overgrown by grass and weeds, the growth of vegetation's death, not life, choked up with too much burying, fat with repleted appetite. A worthy place. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. He advanced towards it trembling. The phantom was exactly as it had been, but he dreaded that he saw no new meaning in its solemn shape.
Before I draw nearer to that stone to which you point, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they the shadows of the things that may be only?
Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which it stood. Men's course
will foreshadow certain ends to which, if persevered in, they must lead, but if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus with which you show me.
The spirit was immovable as ever. Scrooge crept towards it, trembling as he went, and following the finger read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name. Ebenezer Scrooge.
Am I that man who lay upon the bed?
The finger pointed from the grave to him and back again.
Oh, spirit! Oh, no, no!
The finger still was there.
Spirit, hear me. I am not the man I was. I will not be the man I must have been, but for this intercourse. Why, show me this, if I am past all hope.
For the first time the hand appeared to shake.
Good spirit, your nature intercedes for me, pities me. Assure me that I yet may change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life.
The kind hand trembled.
I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Oh, tell me I may sponge away the writing on this stone.
In his agony he caught the spectral hand. It sought to free itself, but he was strong in his entreaty and disdained it. The spirit, stronger still, repulsed him. Holding out his hands in a last prayer to see his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. And one more break, and then we shall read the final stave, the end of it.
Hooray! Tiny Tim, even though it's technically a narrator role at the very end?
Oh, yeah.
Excellent. I'm doing it.
Okay.
Cameo.
Right.
Yep. Gotta change my Zoom name and everything.
Okay, we are live. The end of it. Yes, and the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time before him was his own to make amends in.
I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. Oh, Jacob Marley, heaven in the Christmas time be praised for this. I say it on my knees, old Jacob, on my knees.
He was so fluttered and so glowing with his good intentions that his broken voice would scarcely answer to his call. He had been sobbing violently in the conflict with ears.
They're not torn down. They're not torn down rings at all. They are here. I am here. The shadows of the things that would have been may be dispelled. They will be. I know they will.
His hands were very busy with his garments all this time, turning them inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them, making them parties to every kind of extravagance.
I don't know what to do. I'm as light as a feather. I'm as happy as an angel. I'm as merry as a schoolboy. I'm as giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New Year to all the world. Hello here. Whoop. Hello.
He had frisked into the sitting room and was now standing there perfectly winded.
There's the saucepan that the gruel was in. There's the door by which Jacob Marley entered. There's the corner where I saw the ghost of Christmas present sat. There's the window where I saw the wandering spirits. It's all right. It's all true. It all happened.
Really, for a man who had been out of practice for so many years, it was a splendid laugh, a most illustrious laugh, the father of a long line of brilliant laughs.
I don't know what day of the month it is. I don't know how long I've been among the spirits. I don't know anything. I'm quite a baby. Never mind. I don't care. I'd rather be a baby. Hello. Whoop. Hello there.
He was checked in his transport by the churches ringing the lustiest peals he had ever heard. Clash, crang, hammering, ding-dong bell, ding, ding. Oh, glorious, glorious. Running to the window, he opened it. He put out his head. No fog, no mist, clear, bright, jovial, stirring cold, piping for the blood to dance to. Golden sunlight, heavenly sky, sweet fresh air, merry bells. Oh, glorious, glorious.
What's today?
Scrooge called down to a boy in his Sunday clothes who perhaps had loitered to look about him.
Yeah?
What's today, my fine fellow?
Today? Why, Christmas Day.
It's Christmas Day. I haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. They can do anything they like. Of course they can. Of course they can. Hello, my fine fellow.
Hello.
Do you know the poulterers in the next street but one at the corner?
I should hope I did.
An intelligent boy, a remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one.
What, the one as big as me?
What a delightful boy. It's a pleasure to talk to him. Yes, my buck.
It's hanging there now.
Is it? Go and buy it.
Walker.
No, and I am in earnest. Go and buy it and tell him to bring it here, that I may give them the directions where to take it. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes, and I'll give you a half-crown.
The boy was off like a shot. He must have had a steady hand at a trigger who could have shot half as fast.
I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's. He shan't know who sends it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. Miller never made such a joke as sending it to Bob's will be.
The hand in which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but write it he did, and somehow, and went downstairs to open the street door, ready for the coming of the poulterer's man. As he stood there, waiting his arrival, the knocker caught his eye.
I shall love it as long as I live. I scarcely ever looked at it before. What an honest expression it has in its face. It's a wonderful knocker. Here's the turkey. Hello! Whoop. How are you? Merry Christmas.
It was a turkey. He could never have stood upon his legs. That bird, he would have been snapped him off short in a minute, like sticks of sealing wax.
Why, it's impossible to carry that to Camden Town. You must have a cab.
The chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he paid for the turkey, and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab, and the chuckle with which he compensated the boy, were only to be exceeded by the chuckle with which he sat down mirthless in his chair again, and chuckled till he cried. Shaving was not an easy task, for his hand continued to shake very much, and shaving requires much attention, even though when you don't dance while you're at it. But if he had cut the end of his nose off, he would have been put quite a piece of sticking plaster over it and been quite satisfied. He dressed himself all in his best, and at last got out into the street. The people were by this time pouring forth, as he had seen them with the ghost of Christmas present, and walking with his hands behind him. Scrooge regarded every one with delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant, in a word, that 3 or 4 good-humoured fellows said, "Good morning, sir, and Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge said often afterwards that of all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest to his ear. He had not gone far, when coming on towards him he beheld the portly gentleman, who had walked into his counting-house the day before, and Marley, I believe. It sent a pang across his heart to think how this old gentleman would have looked upon him when they met, and he knew what path lay straight before him, and he took it.
My dear sir, how do you do? I hope you succeeded yesterday. It was very kind of you. A Merry Christmas to you, sir.
Mr. Scrooge?
Yes, that is my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon, and will you have the goodness...
Lord bless me! My dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious?
If you please, not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it. I assure you. Will you do me that favor?
My dear sir, the others... I don't know what to say. Such beneficence.
Don't say anything, please. Come and see me. Will you come and see me?
I will.
Thank ye. I am much obliged to you. I thank you 50 times. Bless you.
He would children on the head and questioned beggars, and looked down into the kitchens and found that everything could yield him pleasure. He had never dreamed that any walk, that anything, could give him so much happiness. In the afternoon he turned his steps. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock. But he made a dash of it and did. Your master is at home, my dear? Oh, sorry, that's you.
Is your master at home, my dear?
Yes, sir.
Where is he, my love?
He is in the dining room, sir, with the mistress. I'll show you upstairs, if you please.
Thank ye. He knows me. I'll go in there, my dear.
He turned gently and sidled his face in around the door, and they were looking at the table, which was spread out in great array, for all those young housekeepers are always so nervous at such points, and like to see that everything is right.
Fred.
Dear heart alive, how
Bless my soul. Who's that?
It's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I've come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?
Let him in. It was a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. He was home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. His niece looked just the same. Wonderful party, wonderful games, wonderful anonymity, wonderful happiness. But he was early in his office the next morning. Oh, he was early there. If he could have only been there first, and catch Bob Cratchit coming late. That was the thing he had set his heart upon. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1/4 past. No Bob. He was full 18 minutes and half behind his time. Scrooge sat with his door wide open, that he might see him come into the tank. His hat was off before he opened the door, his comforter too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen, as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock.
Hello? What do you mean by coming here at this time of day?
I'm very sorry, sir. I am behind my time.
You are? Yes, I think you are. Step this way, sir, if you please.
It's only once a year, sir. It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir.
Now, I'll tell you what, my friend. I am not going to stand this sort of thing any longer, and therefore, I am about to raise your salary.
Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. He had a momentary idea of knocking Scrooge down with it, holding him and calling the people in the court and help with a strait waistcoat.
A Merry Christmas, Bob. A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavor to assist your struggling family, and we will saloon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop, Bob. Make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit.
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend, as good a master, as good a man as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, to see the alteration in him. But he let them laugh and heeded little. He was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good at which some people did not have their fill of laughter at the outset. And knowing that such as these would be blind anyway, he thought it quite so in less attractive forms. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived upon the total abstinence principle ever afterwards, and it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any a man alive possessed. May that truly be said of all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed,
God bless us, everyone.
Okay, well, we decided we're gonna hang out for a little bit. Anyone who wants to and like talk about the Christmas Carol. It's a little longer than we expect. What's everyone's favorite?
That was great. Way to go, everyone.
Good job.
That was
Hell
amazing.
yeah. That was so good.
Ooh.
That was fun.
That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, we're doing good.
I propose we do it again next year.
Yeah.
Let's do it. Slow down. We'll make it a tradition.
Kudos to Sara. Kudos to Sara for putting it all together and bringing us all.
Yeah, great job, girl.
For this.
I'm glad. Thank you to all of you for joining in and like being such good sports about everything. I realized at the end I'd forgotten to cast the housemaid and had to do a fake voice.
I was like, that sounds like Sara doing a different voice. I love it.
Doing a very bad voice. Yes, thank you all. Thanks to all of you. That was great to get that.
That was fun.
So I know, like we said in the interim, like some of you were surprised by some bits because, of course, that was less abridged than the movies usually are.
I've never seen the movie. This is my first experience with this story.
What?
Really?
Not even the Muppets.
The Muppets is the best one, I think.
It really is. I want to go watch it right after this, actually.
I kind of want to watch it too.
I'm a big fan of the one with Scrooge McDuck.
Yes.
I also, the CGI one with Jim Carrey's really good as well. Watched that a couple of times.
There's a made-for-TV version from 1999 that aired on TNT, starring Sir Patrick Stewart.
Ah, yes.
That's
my second favorite.
Yeah.
I saw him do it live on Broadway in like the early 90s.
Wow.
It was amazing. I could see the veins popping out of his bald little head. It was awesome.
I think you broke Jaws.
It had to be amazing.
It's hard for me to say which version of Christmas Carol is my favorite. Like, I hate that they take Belle's song out. I think it's fitting, but easily my favorite Scrooge, hands down, George C. It's the best.
It's a classic.
Yeah, and I mean they added that version of this Christmas Carol just added so much to it. Like when in the past, when his sister comes and says, "Come home, you can come home," and Father's really nice now, except he's not, and George C. Scott, it's old Scrooge watching his past events is just staring his father down, like analyzing everything, and I also love how at the end of the film, stay and he's going out and about. You know, he's meeting with the eaters, and you know, sending the turkey off to Bob's house, and he goes to his nephew's, and yeah, we realized that Scrooge's nephew didn't really have any lines in the book at the end, but again, George C. Scott version. You know, she has a lot of lines. She's welcoming Scrooge into their home as well, and you know, Scrooge asks her if she likes the game Simile, and you know, of course, they were playing it and they were mocking Scrooge and all that. But you know, he's like, oh, by the way, when this clue comes up, this is the answer, and I just love how, you know, one of his last lines with his niece and nephew, at least, is he just says, "God forgive me for all the time I missed," and
Yeah.
I love that. I think that was a great touch.
I can't help it. For me, it's always going to be the Muppets.
Yeah. Agreed.
I mean, credit to Michael Caine for the performance he gave. Absolutely, like he played it as if he had a human cast. Instead, he's talking to. Yeah. You know,
I think there's also something to what you see when you're a kid too. Oh, Amy's got to take off, or did we?
I don't know. He's popping back on.
I actually have a full day of streaming myself tomorrow, so I'm going to go ahead and drop off.
Yeah.
I appreciate the invite. It was a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you, guys. Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, to be fair, Michael Caine could play a doorknob and do a wonderful job. He's just
Yeah, I'd
great.
watch that.
Yeah.
You mean doornail?
Whatever you want, Charlie. Whatever you want. Door knocker. Hey.
Oh, Michael Caine playing knockers. That's a step too far.
I think Josh was a great Scrooge.
Yes.
Yeah.
Really good.
Top
Killed it,
notch.
man.
Thank you. Thanks.
Amazing.
Felt like I was channeling William Shatner there a couple times.
We all were, really.
Yes. Well, my I'm going to end the stream because it's getting very laggy. The computer is getting too much. So I wanted to say to everyone watching, thank you. I hope you enjoyed yourself. Yeah, thank you for coming, and I hope I put some links in the description thing if anyone feels inspired to follow Scrooge's lead and be generous. Food banks are always a good thing. So I will be back in the Zoom shortly, but yes, thank you to everyone who came to the stream, and happy holidays.
Bye.
Merry Christmas.
Bye.